All set, John?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So hello and welcome, and thank you for joining Friends of Bolton Seniors today as we present John Root and Edible Wild Plants of the Northeast. For those of you not familiar with John, he's a presenter of gardening and nature interpretation programs throughout New England at libraries, senior centers, long-term care centers, and other venues. He's a certified landscaping professional and has a BA in biology from Oberlin College and a graduate degree in botany from the University of Maryland and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So today he's presenting Edible Wild Plants of the Northeast, which is he's going to give us a comprehensive introduction into the identification and uses of wild plants for food and beverage. So John, it's all yours. Thank you.
And thanks for joining me. Yes. I've been foraging for edible wild plants for decades now. I do like to begin with this acknowledgement that we live on land that was colonized by Europeans, and so please take a moment to find your location on the map and honor those whose land we now occupy. And so, why would anyone want to forage? Well, there are many reasons I'm drawn to this activity. One is just to save money, because after all, these plants are free, but they're wonderfully healthy as well. And we'll be talking about those health benefits. And, you know, when you serve these foods, people who are sampling the foods that you bring home from the fields and the woods don't even need to know that they're wild plants, that you can just include them in the soup and stand back and watch people enjoy them. They really are quite tasty. And of course, you can let them know afterwards if you like what they just ate. But I love to imagine food kitchens of the future that are run for the benefit of everyone, that people, regardless of need, can just show up and have a wholesome meal, enjoying camaraderie. And those who are in need can help, can feel that they are part of they're making their own contribution by volunteering at these places. So I'm hoping that this is part of the way we imagine creating fellowship around a meal in the future and ensuring food security for everyone. And speaking of security for the planet, there is the question of carbon footprint that we're all very acutely aware of, and food is a huge part of our carbon budget. That the growing and transporting of food results in a lot of carbon emissions. So you can imagine that one of the greenest things you can do is shift, if possible, even even a modest amount. Every amount counts because there's no carbon footprint whatsoever involved in helping yourself to edible wild plants. And then there's just the beauty of these plants. They really are entrancing. Even the most common plants like this this violet here, which you find growing in your lawn, which by the way is edible, and we'll learn about that. But you know, there's a lot of documentation that people who spend time in nature, whether it's in the woods or the fields, they're happier and they're healthier. That's the bottom line. Is people get sick less often, and when they do get sick, they heal a lot more quickly. If they even just have a view of a tree outside their hospital window, for example, or a picture of a tree for that matter on the wall, it makes a big difference to people to feel connected to nature. So guidelines for foraging, and this verb foraging means helping yourself to edible wild plants when you find them in the field or out in nature. You want to be careful and cautious, of course. So proper identification is important. Conservation is another consideration, and safety. So let's take them one at a time. For identifying, please make 100% sure that what you have is actually an edible wild plant, and that you need to actually know it, and knowing the Latin name is actually useful sometimes. Learn the few dangerous species in your area so you know what to avoid. Don't rely on common names. Latin names are helpful. Use all of your senses, including your common sense. But you know, the sense of smell, the sense of touch can often be quite useful, as well as what you see and being able to visually identify a plant. Learn where the plant grows, the habitat. learn what plants grow around it, the companion plants, and also be familiar with that plant at all of its stages of growth throughout the seasons, and learning which parts are safe to use. Conservation, please don't over harvest the plant, only take what you're going to use. Avoid foraging rare and protected wild edible plants. Only collect the part that you plan to use. Consider cultivating them in your garden. Some of them do quite well in your garden. And then for safety, avoid toxic areas. Know what part of the plant is safe in what season. Incidentally, toxic areas could include right along the side of the road because of the fumes that might contaminate those plants. When foraging wild water plants, know the water source, because and also plants can be infested, can carry Giardia, which is a organism that can make you sick. So even when the water is safe, you really want to make sure those plants are well washed. Only forage plants that appear to be healthy, and get permission to forage, because land, privately owned land, the owner may not be take kindly to seeing strangers out there helping themselves. Improve your skills. The more you forage, the more proficient you'll become. With each new plant, study all of its uses, including the medicinal uses. And the more you do this, the more you'll be comfortable and confident in being able to identify and use plants. Now, stay away from the following plants. A giant hogweed is it's the dermatitis that's the problem. It's a light sensitive skin reaction. So if it's a bright day and you touch this plant, watch out. The blisters, the scarring can last for years. That can even cause long-term sunlight sensitivity or even blindness if it gets in your eye, the sap of this plant. Fortunately, this is not a very common plant. It's a huge plant, giant hogweed. Now, there's no excuse for mistaking these plants, mistaking moonseed for grapes, because I mentioned earlier using your common sense as well as your sense of smell. Those fruits do not smell at all like grapes. Those Canada moonseed fruits.
John,
Grapes will always smell like.
Are you referencing slides right now?
Excuse me?
Are you referencing slides right now? Because I think we're only seeing the Eastern Hemlock slide.
Oh my goodness, I don't know why that is. So let me go back. I'm gonna have to start again here. Okay, so it shows that I'm okay. Play from current slide. Do you see the first slide now?
Nope.
No. Well, I'm going to have to back up. I thought we were all set here. All right. So. I'm going back to the beginning. I'm launching the meeting on Zoom. Okay, I'm trying to launch the meeting and nothing's happening. I'm trying to go back to the beginning. Okay, share the screen. All right, let's see. Oh, now I'm not even seeing the. Okay, I'm going to have to bring up the PowerPoint again. Okay, so share screen. How am I doing? Do you see it now? Hello?
Yep, I think we're on the first screen. This is
Yep.
edible wild plants.
All right.
Yep, we're good.
Okay, so I'm going to begin again. So please take a moment to find your location on the map and honor those whose land we now occupy. I feel this is an important acknowledgement and a feeling of reverence for those who used to live here and knew so much about the land and about what was growing here as well. So we stand to benefit from their wisdom and from their knowledge. So the reasons for foraging are many. You can save a lot of money because the food is free. Your health can be improved because these plants have wonderful health benefits. I like to imagine that in the future we'll have soup kitchens at which people will be able to help themselves regardless of income, and it'll give us all a chance to eat healthy food and have fellowship with others. And edible wild plants could be part of this this bounty. It's important to be kind to Mother Earth, and we are mindful that much of our carbon footprint has to do with the food that is grown and that is shipped to us. So edible wild plants have a very low carbon footprint and can make a contribution to protecting the planet. And then there's just enjoying the beauty of Mother Nature, and it's so inspiring and just good for our health, both physical and mental health, to be outdoors. It's a wonderful activity to enjoy with either by yourself or with others, and to raise our children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews to give them this appreciation of nature. So I'd like to recommend that you pay attention to these three areas of concern: proper identification, conservation, and safety. And as for identification, be 100% sure your plant that you're considering harvesting is not poisonous. Learn the dangerous species in your area. Don't rely on common names. It's helpful to learn Latin names as well. Use all of your senses, including your common sense. So, for example, you could smell the plant and that might give you valuable information as well as what it looks like. Learn the habitat. Learn companion plants that grow near it. Learn to follow the plant throughout its cycle of growth, and learn which parts of a plant are safe to use. Don't over-harvest the plant. Only take what you can use. Avoid foraging rare and protected wild edible plants. Only collect the part that you plan to use. Consider cultivating wild edible plants in your garden. And avoid toxic areas such as roadsides. Know what part of the plant is safe in what season. When foraging wild water plants, know the water source. Only forage plants that appear to be healthy. So the more you do this, the better you'll get at identifying and locating the plants that you're interested in. With each new plant, study all of its uses, including its medicinal value. You'll become more and more comfortable with the natural world as you broaden your catalog of useful wild plants. Here are some plants that you want to avoid. Giant hogweed causes a light sensitive skin reaction that can be quite painful and could even cause blindness if the sap gets into your eye. The Canada moonseed berries that look a little bit like grapes are toxic, but they don't smell at all like grapes. So this is this is an illustration of how it's important to use your senses. Also, grape tendrils are always forked, like as you see in this image, and Canada moonseed doesn't have forked tendrils like that. Virginia creeper fruits are edible for birds, but not for us. And this is a kind of a lesson to learn. Just because you see animals eating something does not mean that you can eat it. This is a poisonous plant that children have actually died. This has caused fatalities because those fruits are so colorful and tempting to children, although they don't taste at all good and the foliage smells terrible. But this plant is quite toxic. It's a relative of tomatoes, incidentally. Bittersweet or nightshade. Carolina horse nettle is in the same family and is not at all appealing in terms of the taste, but it might look to some people like a cherry tomato. Pokeweed is actually an edible plant, and we'll talk about it later, but there are parts the plant that are quite toxic, even toxic for to touch. For example, if you're uprooting the plant and it is a weed, you might have skin dermatitis from touching the root. And they're also the root and other parts of the plant are also toxic to eat if you're not eating the right part of the plant, or you're eating at the wrong time of year. Wild cherry leaves, wilted leaves, have killed livestock, and the pits of cherries contain cyanide, but the fruit itself is fine. Wisteria flowers are edible, but the pods are deathly poisonous. Just because they look like beans, please don't eat them. And this is an example of just being able to tell one from the other. They're sometimes buckeye and Chinese chestnut can be confused with each other because they both have fairly large brown shiny nuts, but you can see that the buckeye has that eye, which is why it's called buckeye. Chinese chestnut does not. Also, Chinese chestnut comes in spiny burrs. So that's the one that's edible, not the buckeye. Now, poison ivy, of course, is not edible, and all parts of the plant can cause dermatitis, including that root that, or rather the vine itself that grows up the trunk and attaches itself with those hairy protuberances. And in fact, you never want to burn wood that has that vine attached to it, because it can kill you just inhaling the smoke. And as you're well aware, just touching leaves at any stage of growth or the vine itself can give you at times pretty severe skin dermatitis. And if this is possible, poison sumac is even worse than poison ivy. Unfortunately, it's not a very common plant. You'll only find poison sumac growing in wetlands. You'll notice it has white fruits. There are other sumacs I'll be talking about that have red fruits, which are totally safe, but not poison sumac. Thankfully, there's this plant called touch-me-not or jewelweed, which you'll find growing in fairly moist places. And it can be, the leaves can be used. If you crush the leaves or crush the entire plant, including that stem, which is quite succulent, you can use the sap of that plant to even prevent the contact dermatitis of poison ivy from happening if you've been exposed, and you treat, if you cover your skin in that area of those areas on your body that have been exposed, you won't get the rash. And if you already have the rash, it's a treatment for the poison ivy dermatitis. And a sweet fern is even better. This is a plant that grows in dry places. It's not a fern at all, actually, it's a shrub. And if you make a tea out of those leaves, you can take a bath in that, add the tea to your bath water and take a bath. Imagine if many parts of your body had blisters from poison ivy. This is an excellent cure or a remedy for that contact dermatitis from poison ivy. And while we're at it, talking about things that can happen outdoors which are not agreeable, I'm sure you're aware that ticks carry the Lyme disease and other diseases. So, and it's the deer tick that we're concerned about, that tiny thing you can see on the person's fingernail there. Sometimes, but not always, there's a bullseye pattern that where the tick bit the skin. Now I'd like to, just to continue talking about the ticks for a moment, you can buy repellents, and you can also get something called permethrin to spray your clothes with if you do so about a couple of days before use. But the effect of it lasts for more than 7 washings, interestingly. So it's pretty effective to spray your clothing with permethrin. And you can also tuck your pants into your socks to prevent the ticks from being able to climb up your pant leg. And there's some other tricks of the trade there to try to avoid getting and of course just inspecting yourself or inspecting each other if you've been out with a family member to make sure that there are no ticks on your body, and giving yourself a shower when you come home. So here are some experts, educators, and authors I'd like to recommend. Wildman Steve Brill is one of my favorites, and that book of his, Identifying and Harvesting Edible and Medicinal Plants, is probably the best book you could get as an introductory, but also comprehensive field guide. And he has a website that's fantastic, wildmanstevebrill.com. He even has an app, and he has videos. Quite an interesting guy. He was a vegetarian chef, a vegan chef, and then he discovered edible wild plants, and that became a major interest of his. So he has a lot of, I just highly recommend. In fact, many of the images on this program were borrowed with his permission to create, he has wonderful photographs of these plants that you'll be seeing in this program. Here's another expert, Samuel Thayer. He's got a couple of wonderful books and has a number of resources that he offers, including he even sells plants. And you can go to the internet and watch interviews with him and learn a lot. Another one on the internet has an internet presence, Josh Vecteau, joshvecteau.com. And he talks about reasons to go outside, not just edible wild plants, but and Blanche Derby, she was an art teacher, and in fact taught my oldest son, who's now 45, was his art teacher. So she's still at it, and that's her book, My Wild Friends. She also has an online presence, so you could watch videos. She features just one plant at a time, and you can learn a lot about that plant. And she has a sense of humor, so it's really enjoyable to watch her videos. And then there's Russ Cohen, who lives in the eastern part of the state and has done a lot of presentations and edible wild plant walks. There's his book, Wild Plants I Have Known and Eaten. And he also does public plantings. He wants to keep these plants available for people. So where there's space, he'll go ahead and he'll get permission and go ahead and establish these plants so that people will be able to use them and enjoy them into the future. And then Adam Harriton, learnyourland.com. I recommend his videos highly, 125 different plant and mushroom videos. And so here are perhaps my four favorite edible wild plant websites: or Eat the Weeds, Edible Wild Food, again, wildmanstevebrill.com, and greendean.com. It always helps to have field guides handy of the different kinds of vegetation, the wildflowers, the shrubs, and trees. And now I'd like to introduce you to the first of the plants I'll be talking about. Chickweed. Common chickweed is the more common and smaller of the two. Then there's also star or great chickweed. Notice if you pinch the stem, but not all the way through, there's a green pith that is elastic. So it's almost like there's a green rubber band right in the middle of that, running the length of that stem. Very remarkable how it's elastic and it'll spring back. And that's just not true of any other plant that I'm aware of. So chickweed is delicious eaten raw. Another thing to notice, by the way, is that the leaves have an opposite, they're paired. This is called opposite arrangement of the leaves instead of alternate. There's also a single row of hairs on the stem if you look very closely. That instead of covering the stem completely, it's just one line of hairs marching up the stem, another unique characteristic of chickweed. And the health benefits are truly impressive. A long list of vitamins, minerals, and other flavonoids, antioxidant, carotenoids, phytosterols, glycosides. Treatment used to be considered something that you would take regardless of what illness you had. And you really can't go wrong with chickweed because there can't possibly be any negative side effects, even topical treatments. Common plantain is a plant that you'll often find in your yard. It has no problem at all with traffic. In fact, it thrives when people are walking up and down in compacted soil. And while the leaves are edible, it's not a plant that I'm particularly drawn to when I'm planning my meals. However, it is considered a very useful medicine chest plant. Carpenter's weed is called, because you can crush the leaf and apply it to a wound, or even use the leaf as a poultice without crushing it at all. Has amazing healing properties. It can give you relief from bee stings and wasp stings as well, or even poison ivy rash. Dandelion, one of my absolute favorite plants. It's in April when this plant is most available and tasty. Later on, when it's in bloom, it's no longer that appealing because it's just too bitter. The leaves are too bitter at that point. You can harvest the flowers, by the way, they're edible. My sister has a great recipe for dandelion flowers if you have the patience and the time to pluck those flowers one by one and gather them and bring them home. But I just love the leaves, either eaten raw in salads or cooked. When I cook them, by the way, I don't cook them. I never boil greens. I always just barely. I throw them on top of my vegetables that I'm stir frying, and then at the last couple of minutes, just throw the leaves on top of whatever plant I have, and they're done very quickly. Just let them wilt, and they're cooked. But they're delicious raw dandelion greens, and they're most healthy that way. They have the most nutrients and vitamins and minerals when you eat them raw. The roots are also edible. You can roast them, but they're more a survival food. To be honest, I don't think I've ever eaten the roots, but they are quite medicinal. And for that matter, you could roast them and make a coffee substitute. There is no caffeine in those roots, but it tastes a little bit like coffee. And as for the health benefits of dandelion, truly impressive. The vitamins, the minerals, there's even a decent amount of protein in dandelion leaves. And if you compare dandelion leaves to spinach, kale, and collards, pretty impressive. Kale is a well-deserved superfood in terms of greens. It's hard to beat kale, and yet dandelion is superior to kale in some of these categories. For example, omega-6, calcium, iron, those are some of them, and pretty close in other categories. Chicory is closely related to dandelion, and unfortunately, chicory is often found growing alongside of the road, and I would not want to forage plants that are so close to the fumes from a car exhaust. But when I find them far enough away from the road, it's the leaves that are growing in a rosette, just like you find dandelions. I don't eat them raw, but I do use them as a delicious cooked greens. Chicory is also well known for coffee substitute, just like dandelion. You can roast the root. It's in France, or in New Orleans, and in the Cajun culture, this is considered part of coffee. You know, half and half coffee and chicory roots. This is what the rosette of chicory greens looks like before the plant bolts and before it forms those blue flowers that you saw. Notice that if you look very closely, you can see some faint fuzzy hairs on these leaves. Distinguishes them from dandelion, which has no hairs at all. And again, I would not eat them raw. They don't taste as good as dandelion raw, but they're a wonderful cooked green after the dandelion season is pretty much past. You can still find chicory. Sow thistle is a plant that has edible greens as well, not one that I have particular experience with, but I just like to share that information. This is one that I do enjoy, winter cress. It's in this mustard family. Those dark, shiny, dark green leaves can be found flourishing on, and they're quite low to the ground at that time of year in the winter. Later on, the flower will bolt and form those yellow flowers. But when they're still in the rosette stage, they are just a wonderfully hearty, slightly bitter. You wouldn't eat this plant raw. It would be way too bitter for that. But it's even as a cooked green, it can really pack a punch in terms of being strong tasting. But if you're a cook and know what to do with plants like that, it's just a truly impressive powerhouse of nutrients. And it's related to watercress. You can see the leaves have this kind of a similar shape. Watercress only grows in water. And I've discovered in recent years that Even while watercress has a deserved reputation for tasting great in salads, it's also fine as a cooked greens, and I've eaten a lot of it that way. I would want to be aware of the water source. There's always a possibility of Giardia contamination, for example, when you're foraging wetland plants, so be mindful of that. You might want to really rinse your plants well when you bring them home. Garlic mustard is another plant in the mustard family. The leaves don't look anything like the wintercress and watercress that we just saw, but they are, this is an invasive plant and it grows everywhere, unfortunately. It has the ability to actually inhibit the growth of nearby plants by exuding toxic chemicals through their roots that inhibit the growth of other plants. But you might as well eat it when you find it. And the best time in this photo in the lower right-hand corner, when it's fairly young, is the time that it tastes the best. I wouldn't eat it raw, but you can cook it and it's a perfectly good tasting vegetable. The water leaf is a plant that I have very little experience with, but it's fascinating to see the variability of the leaf, the coloration, the patterns of coloration. Violets I highly recommend, and it's really too bad that so few people know that violet greens are edible. Everyone knows, for example, that you can eat dandelion greens, but violet greens are just as common, just widely available, and throughout the season, which is different from dandelions. You're pretty much avoiding them once summer comes, unless you're picking the flowers. But violet leaves and the flowers are also edible if you like, but it's the leaves that give you the nutrition, and you can eat them raw or cooked. They have more vitamin C than oranges. I think the taste is quite good, so it's not merely edible. I think it's a delicious wild green and you can also often find considerable quantities of these greens. Stinging nettle, who would have thought that the plant that you would think you'd want to totally avoid is actually one of the best greens out there. In fact, it's rated as the best land plant food in the world, following only seaweed in terms of nutritional benefits. So of course you want to harvest it carefully, because stinging nettle leaves and every part of the plant is definitely going to cause that painful reaction if you touch it. But if you're wearing gloves that those stingers cannot penetrate, and just a word to the wise, not all gloves will offer sufficient protection, but you would want to harvest the plant when it's fairly young, and as soon as it's cooked, it's perfectly healthy and harmless. Or for that matter, if you dry the leaves, then you can touch them and you can make a very hearty and healthy stinging nettle tea. So notice how the leaves are opposite, just as they are in mint family members. In fact, this, for those of you who are familiar with what mints look like, it does look kind of superficially like a mint. So stinging nettle has some really wonderful, and this is the stage that you want to find them in the early spring when they're still fairly small. It's a good time to harvest them for eating them as greens. One of the best uses of and most well-known and actually scientifically documented uses of stinging nettle is for people who suffer from allergies. So regularly drinking stinging nettle tea would help you with those symptoms. So to make, now this kind of nettle tea is actually for gardeners, because if you soak nettle leaves in a bucket of water and then just leave after a few weeks, all those wonderful nutrients have been absorbed by the water, and you can use this as an organic fertilizer for a variety of vegetables and fruit trees and bushes, your plants will love it. Or you can even put it in your compost pile to add nutrients to your compost pile. Now, a wood nettle doesn't look anything like stinging nettle. Notice how the leaves are not opposite, but they are in a whorled arrangement, or alternate leaves. This is a plant that usually grows in the woods, hence the name wood nettle. If it's if it's allowed to grow in the sun, and if you plant it in the sun, it'll get a lot taller than it gets in the shade. Wood nettle is every bit as painful to touch as stinging nettle is, and yet it's every bit as delicious as stinging nettle as well. Now, in Britain, where there's a lot of nettle, they have a saying, "A nettle in, dock out." And what they mean by that is that if you're stung by any kind of nettle, stinging nettle, the leaves of dock will give you relief if you chew the leaf of curly dock or the broadleaf dock, which is here. Either of these two species, chew the leaf and apply it to your sting, you're going to get relief from the stinging nettle. And so it's a good one to know about. But I'm also including this plant as an edible plant because it's useful for that purpose as well. The leaves in the basal rosette, as they appear here in the lower left image, they're fairly sour tasting, and they look kind of funny when you cook them. They look almost grayish green. So while it may not look appetizing, and even the taste itself might not be your favorite, but you can consider combining it with other wild greens, and the combination of those greens might actually be quite tasty to you. And I'm also including the photo of the roots. It's called yellow dock because the roots are yellow. This is a medicinal root. So curly dock, those are the leaves that you bring home foraging, and you can make baked curly dock chips, or there are other recipes as well. So look it up online and see what you find. And here's the broadleaf dock. I'm only including this slide because, just like the curly dock, it'll give you relief from the stinging nettle sting. However, it's not an edible wild plant. It doesn't have any, it's not at all appealing to eat broadleaf dock leaves. It's not poisonous, but I wouldn't put it on my list of things to bring home either. Now, culinary delights. The fiddlehead ferns of the ostrich, the fiddleheads of the ostrich ferns. All ferns start out as fiddleheads, but it's only the fiddleheads of the ostrich fern that foragers are going to bother bringing home. And you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, that's what they look like when they're poking up in the spring. And then when you forage them, you wouldn't take every one of these fiddleheads. You'd take just a couple from each clump to make sure that you're not harming the plant. And then you'd scrape off this light brown chaff that is attached to the fiddleheads and bring them home and cook them. And notice how on the lower right-hand corner, you'll see what the fertile frond looks like. It's very distinctive, how the way that it angles up on either side. These are very tall ferns at maturity, and you'll find them growing near streams or in seasonally flooded places. Here's some more photos of the fiddlehead fern. Notice the upper left-hand corner here. There's a kind of a base on all three images on the left. Through even in the winter, you can notice the appearance of this fern is quite different from other ferns. They don't have this kind of black protrusion from the ground. Wild asparagus is no different from cultivated asparagus. It's simply escaped from cultivation, and you'll see the mature plant is tall and very feathery looking. The leaves are almost invisible; they're so small. So if you see them in the summer, just remember that in the spring, and remember where they are. In the spring, they'll be poking up those shoots, and you can help yourself. Now, I mentioned that pokeweed is a poisonous plant, and you can see there are a number of names for it. Poke salad, it's called down south. And this happens to be America's favorite edible wild vegetable. So let me explain that you have to know when to harvest it. And the photo in the lower left will show you what it looks like. You don't want to pick it when it's any taller than that. Say about asparagus height, if it would be a good comparison. Just a matter of certainly less than a foot high, and because that's when it's safest in terms of it hasn't accumulated enough of the toxic chemicals that make it problematic. And also what you want to do is you take a pot of water and boil it, get it boiling hard, and then you plunge the shoots into that water and cook and boil the plant for 15 minutes or so, and then it becomes safe to eat. Some wild plant experts say you should do that twice, in a second, drain off that water, and then in a fresh pot of water, give it another boiling. And it happens to be a delicious plant. As a matter of fact, French chefs consider it to be just as tasty, if not more so, compared to the asparagus that we all know and love. So it's worth going ahead and being an informed forager, of course, and knowing how to prepare it. But it's America's favorite edible wild plant because it is down south. It's part of their culture to harvest and use this plant. I'd like you to look at this photo on the upper left to see what it looks like in the winter when all the leaves have died, but that you'll see these pale looking stems. And if you open up one of the stems, there's a reticulated pith. The stem is not completely hollow. There are these little discs of vegetative of the pith inside that, and sometimes you'll find ants living in there as well because it's good protection for them. So the stems always are forked. There's never one primary leader stem. So that's another way you can tell the pokeweed. Even in the winter, you can find where areas where you'll be able to forage in the spring. These plants get quite tall, easily over 6 feet tall sometimes, and yet the entire plant dies back in the winter, and it just sends up another shoot and continues getting bigger and bigger every year. So there it is, a plate of poke greens, the leaves and the stems of when they're still small and tender. That's when you want to pick them. Some more pokeweed recipes there for you. Japanese knotweed is something else that's edible as a shoot coming up in the spring. If you peel those shoots, this is a highly invasive plant, by the way, and it's very difficult to get rid of, but you might as well know about it if you're a forager, because no one will ever mind if you harvest some Japanese knotweed. They're trying to get rid of it. It's a rhubarb substitute. So if you like rhubarb, you'll probably like Japanese knotweed. Whatever recipe calls for rhubarb, you can make that substitution. Japanese knotweed tastes just fine. There it is, Japanese knotweed ready for the kitchen. Now, daylily, either the roots or the shoots or the flowers, all those plant parts are edible. I do want to comment, though, that about 5% of the population is not able to eat daylily comfortably. Some people have a bit of an upset stomach in reaction to whatever part of the plant, or especially the tubers, it seems to me, can cause that reaction. But the flowers are the part that I like and the most, and the buds before they open, you'll see in the upper left corner here of this photo, or the flowers that were open yesterday. It's called daylily for a reason. They bloom for one day. So the next day the flowers close, the petals close, and you can harvest them as well. And sauteing with other vegetables, it's a wonderful kind of oriental flavor, the sweet and sour kind of impression, that combination of taste. So I highly recommend daylily as something to liven up your stir fry. The greens in the spring are also edible. The taste to me is not particularly noteworthy, but they're certainly edible. You want to make sure that this is not a lily, but it's a daylily. Lilies have bulbs rather than tubers, so it's the bulbs that would confirm, and also the way that the leaves go to left and right in a plane, as it were, but they don't, instead of going all around the stem. One of my all-time favorite plants is wild leek, also called ramps. This is the best tasting onion in the world, in my opinion. It's a fairly small bulb, and it's been overpicked because people love it so much. Fancy restaurants will pay a lot for foragers who supply them with this plant. So you can grow it yourself it's found in the woods, but it does just fine out in the sunlight. In fact, it'll get bigger in the sun. Notice how the leaves look a little bit like lily of the valley leaves, but they certainly don't smell or taste like them. You wouldn't eat lily of the valley, incidentally, but one smell of the leaves will confirm to you this is a member of the onion family, and both the leaves and the tubers are absolutely delicious. Now, perhaps my favorite plant, Lambsquarters. The reason for that is that I'm able to pick so much of it. It tastes, in my opinion, better than spinach, and it's a close relative of spinach. It grows in profusion, often on compost piles, so it really does quite well in that rich soil, or in people's gardens and in farms for that matter. So to identify Lambsquarters, notice the Latin name, Chenopodium album. Album means white, and you'll see the whitish powder on the small leaves, both on the upper surfaces and the lower surfaces of the smallest leaves in particular. And you'll be able to feel that powder, and you'll be able to rub it off if you just rub a leaf between your index finger and your thumb. You'll see that powder is removed, and then that changes the color of the leaf. This plant can be eaten raw. It's delicious as a substitute for lettuce, but it's also fantastic as a cooked green. And you want to bring home a large amount, because when you cook it, it really reduces substantially in size. So I have, when I find large amounts, which I often do on farmers' compost piles, and if I have permission to harvest, I'll just bring home large quantities, and I'll freeze some for later use. Now the plant in the upper left-hand corner, this is too old, and the one on the right also too old to harvest. The one in the lower left is just right. And often you can pick the plant and then come back a week or two later, and it's sending up new shoots, and you can pick them as well. So definitely an incredibly nutritious plant, more impressive than spinach for that matter, has more iron and more minerals than even spinach does. And the taste, I consider it to be, and many people think that Lambsquarters actually tastes better than spinach as well. Clovers, I'm not very excited about, to be honest. The flowers, however, can be used in tea. For example, the red clover flower is one of the is an ingredient in some herbal combinations, and you can even eat those flowers, which are fairly sweet. And dayflower is edible. The leaves are fairly bland tasting, and purslane leaves, unbelievably nutritious. That they have omega-3s, which you expect to find in fish oil, but you don't expect to find in a plant. Purslane plants are cosmopolitan. They grow all over the world, and they grow in urban areas as well as in your garden, just in sidewalk cracks and that kind of thing. So notice how succulent the leaves are, and the stem as well, that pink, very round looking stem. You can pick a purslane stem and just let it sit for a while, and it takes forever to wilt. All that water is stored in the leaf and keeps it fresh. So either raw or cooked, purslane is a delicious vegetable, very versatile. You can come up with a variety of recipes that will really bring out the taste of other foods as well. Ground elder has a number of uses, a number of nutrients, as well as medicinal uses. And this is a plant that it can be pretty invasive, actually, and looks a lot like members of the carrot family. It is a member of the carrot family, with those compound leaves and the small white flowers. Yellow wood sorrel is really more a nibble than a serious food for foragers. Notice the heart-shaped leaflets, which distinguish it from clover. Clover never has heart-shaped leaflets. Clover also doesn't have yellow flowers, but the three leaflets make it superficially appear to be clover. And has a pleasing sour taste. So sometimes children they call it sour grass, yellow wood sorrel. Children enjoy that sour taste. Here's another sour tasting vegetable, sheep sorrel, and notice how the leaf looks a little bit like a sheep's head. You can imagine this is the nose and these are the ears. So there's a garden sorrel that's cultivated, common sorrel or a French sorrel, profusion sorrel. And you can use sheep sorrel in the same dishes. It's a fairly sour tasting plant. You can make sorrel soup with wood sorrel, for example. This plant tends to grow in acidic soil. Now, cattail is called the supermarket of the swamps. My favorite part of it is the what's called Cossack asparagus. And if you yank those stalks out of when they're fairly tall, but before they make the cattails, yank them out of the muck and peel away the dark covering that surrounds that tender inner core, that inner core, which ends up being a fairly small part of the total. You've thrown away a lot, in other words, when you remove the tough outer layers of leaf. But that inner part is what's tasty, either as a salad ingredient, or you can cook it up in a stir fry. Tastes a little bit like a combination of zucchini and cucumber. You can also eat the underground portions, and there are two parts. There's both the rhizome, and then there's also the leading edge that comes from the rhizome that's waiting in the spring to come up and form the new shoots. And then finally, the male cattail, which is the one on top. You see this photo here where the female is still green down below, and the one on top, you can see there's pollen being born here. Well, before the pollen forms, it looks much like the female. It's also firm and green, and you can snap that off and steam it for about 10 minutes and eat cattail on the cob. And then you can also harvest the pollen and use it in any baked good recipe, say 20% or so of the substituting about 20% of the flour with cattail pollen. It takes a lot of foraging to get a significant amount of pollen, but that is a possible use for cattails. Common milkweed it's often assumed that this is a poisonous plant, but it's not true. And it can be eaten at different stages, both as a young plant, and when it comes up in the spring, those shoots are edible as greens. Later on, when the flower buds are born and later on, when it's taller, you can just cut off the top few pairs of leaves and bring them home as leafy greens. Then the flower buds and the flowers themselves, when they open, are edible, and so are the pods, but only if you pick them when they are immature. Consider them to be a kind of a green bean substitute, because like green beans, you need to pick them when they're still soft and tender. If you don't pick them soon enough, they become quite tough and hard. In the case with milkweed, they have the seeds that are born inside the pod, and if they're too mature, that pod won't be appetizing at all. But when you pick them in about half size, like the one on the upper left here, they actually taste quite similar to green beans. You wouldn't eat them raw, but cooking them makes them pretty appealing. Dogbane, incidentally, is not edible, but common milkweed is. So it often, when you're picking in the spring, you want to make sure that you have the correct plant. Now, speaking of confusing plants that might be being aware of what plant is edible and what is not. The Oxide Daisy is, but this Erigeron philadelphicus, okay, not, and so Daisy Fleabane. So, and any plant that has bane in the title, that's a red flag for you. So the flowers are obviously quite different. Daisy Fleabane has multiple small petals, and the flower itself is small, while the petals of the Oxide Daisy are much larger and fewer. Oxide Daisy plants are shorter as well. And it's the flower buds and the small leaves at the tips of the stems that are quite tasty, and you can put them in your salad. Burdock is an edible plant. and it's actually highly prized in Oriental cuisine, and you can find it at Oriental markets. This long, slender root. You would, if you harvest it at the end of summer, and you can imagine it's difficult to harvest any quantity of that root because it just keeps on going down and down and down, further and further. So I'm not sure how it's cultivated to enable farmers to harvest the entire root, but it can be harvested at the end of its first year or the beginning of the second. It's a biennial root, and it's a fairly common weed that sends up very, very large leaves, which themselves are not edible. They taste terrible, as a matter of fact. However, in the second year, you can eat the stalks as they're being, before the flowers are formed. You can peel those stalks and put them in a casserole. That's a part of Italian cuisine. But the root is actually the more well-known use, and it's not only is it a tasty root, it's quite healthy. It's good for the immune system. Now, I mentioned Lambsquarters as being one of my favorite plants. Well, Amaranth is right up there, because once Lambsquarters is past its prime, Amaranth is still going strong. Notice how the root is fairly pinkish or reddish. They call it red root for that reason. Notice also how the leaves have very distinct veins underneath. You can feel the veins, which makes it a fairly distinctive characteristic to help you identify the plant. And like Lambsquarters, you want to pick it when it's fairly young, although you can pick plants that are as tall as 3 or 4 feet and still find just harvest the parts that are still tender. But you would not pick it once it has gone to seed. Amaranth, while it's not appealing as an edible wild plant to be eaten raw, you would not put it in your salad, but it's a delicious greens, just as hearty and just as nutritious as Lambsquarters. It's also a relative of both Lambsquarters and spinach. So it's one of my favorite plants. Amaranth, again, I'll pick large quantities of it sometimes and freeze bags of them, so I'll have them for later use. Evening primrose, the young roots and the young leaves are both edible. And you'll find recipes in online or at wildmanstevebrill.com. Queen Anne's lace, the foliage smells a lot like carrots. In fact, this wild carrot is just that. It tastes, it looks just like the cultivated carrot. You could make carrot seed tea with these seeds that are born at the end of the second year of this plant. And it's important to be aware of a plant called water hemlock, which can only be found in wetlands. Notice how the distinct clusters of white flowers that make it look different from the Queen Anne's lace. Remember also, I encourage you to use your sense of smell. And if these leaves don't smell like carrot, you know that it's not wild carrot. And if you're in the wetlands, you can imagine that there's a good chance that you have actually found the deadly poisonous water hemlock. Surprisingly, Solomon seal is an edible plant when they come up in the spring. I would not harvest them if growing in the wild, but I think it's fine to grow them yourself in your garden, and then you can harvest as much as you like. But it's just not that well established. I think it's important to leave plants in the wild that are not as common as we would like them to be. This is an important plant it's useful for pollinators, and we don't want to affect it, adversely affect the population. It's an amazing plant also. Jim McDonald, an herbalist, says it's the most useful remedy he knows of for treating injuries to the musculoskeletal system. He has personal experience. He had a slipped disc, for example. And so what he says is that he knows of several instances himself when use of this plant of the tuber prevented the need for surgery, and also he has seen its speed recovery time for people who have had surgery. So you'd have to learn, do your research to find how to use the plant, or perhaps find how to purchase it from a herbal supply company, and what the recommended doses and that sort of thing would be. One of my all-time favorite fruits out there is the Juneberry, variety of common names. Shadbush, Saskatoon are also common names of different species of Amelanchier. And these fruits are, in my opinion, just as good tasting as blueberries, perhaps even better. Usually they are red at maturity, and they're fairly small. Birds love them also. And what a beautiful plant. A profusion of white flowers in the spring, followed by the fruits, and then in the fall with beautiful foliage. It's a small tree that deserves a place in your landscape. Even if you're just feeding the wildlife, it's, and you're providing flowers for pollinators, what's not to like about that? Wild strawberry is a fairly common plant, often found in lawns, for example. Distinguish it from mock strawberry, which has yellow flowers. Now, wild strawberry fruits are difficult to come by. Often animals find them, or it's hard to actually find a good supply of wild strawberries. But foraging for wild strawberries is a memory that to be cherished, and it goes back many generations. Black raspberry is to be distinguished from blackberry in a couple of different ways. One is that the flowers are virtually, the petals are almost are quite insignificant, almost not visible. They're so small, which is different from blackberry flowers. The fruits, notice how when you pick a raspberry of any color, whether it's black, red, or another, they're also yellow and purple varieties, they are hollow when you pick them. The thorns of black raspberries are not nearly as sharp and large as blackberry thorns. And you can also rub the stems of a black raspberry, and there's a bloom that kind of rubs off when you touch it. So black raspberries are usually ripe at around sometime in July, maybe even June. Here's the purple flowering raspberry, and the beautiful blossoms of this plant make it quite attractive on your landscape. And those red fruits, the red raspberries of the purple flowering raspberry, are perfectly edible as well. And then, as I mentioned, the blackberry is quite distinct in both in having larger petals that are quite showy, relatively speaking, and the blackberries, when you pick them, they're not hollow as raspberries would be. You do need to watch out for those thorns, but blackberries and black raspberries are much appreciated by wildlife as well as humans. And blackberries are typically ripe in late July and into August. Now, the mulberry looks superficially like a blackberry, but they are born on trees, and they can be either black at maturity or red or white. There are 3 different species. Notice how the leaves are very shiny. Those fruits are absolutely delicious, and the birds agree, and you'll see birds just flocking over mulberry trees and helping themselves. I often help myself to the fruits that have fallen on the ground. If there's you can see them there on the lawn and just pick them up and put them in your basket, but I never bring them home. I just eat them on the spot. American elderberry is one of my favorite plants, Sambucus canadensis. These beautiful flowers, which are valuable to pollinators, followed by the fruits, which birds very much appreciate. Celtic lore, including such interesting facts that they were planted around homes for protection. You had to ask permission for three times before cutting branches. You would not burn it or you'd be cursed, according to Celtic lore. And people would give gifts and lay them on the ground for this plant. They would be planted on the graves of loved ones because the blossoms would indicate happy souls in the hereafter. They believed that witches would be exposed if elder juice was smeared around their eyes. Pregnant women would kiss the elderberries to ensure babies' good fortune. The flowers are symbolic of purification, love, compassion, and zealousness. And those of you who have read Harry Potter books are aware that the elder wand was the most powerfully magical. Now, nutritional benefits and medicinal uses are many. Elderflower tea is one use of this plant. As you can see, there are many conditions that can be treated with elderflower tea. And then there's elderflower poultices, which can help with various skin conditions. And it's the fruits that are truly amazing with their impressive vitamin content, minerals, flavonoid antioxidants, anthocyanins. The elderberry syrup is a wonderful thing to have on hand in the winter. If you feel that you have a flu coming on, reach for that elderberry syrup, take it several times a day, and you're bound to perhaps ward off the flu or recover a lot faster. In fact, if you just take elderberry syrup routinely throughout the winter, you're much less likely to get the flu. There are some cautions with the elderberry. Avoid it if you have an organ transplant, or if you take medicine for diabetes, or if you have an autoimmune condition, and don't take it if you have, don't use it if you're taking any of the following medications. Black cherry it's a real honest to goodness cherry, no question about it. The cherries are much smaller than the cherries we're used to purchasing in the store, but it's a very common tree. And it's a kind of a weedy tree. It pops up in recently cleared land, and birds love it. The pollinators love it, and I find the fruits can be quite tasty if you don't mind the large pit and the small amount of fruit. Black cherries and choke cherries are different. Choke cherries are usually not that tasty, not nearly as tasty as black cherries. Notice how the choke cherry leaves are much white and much broader than black cherry leaves are. Beech plum is a wild shrub, I guess you'd say, that grows on the Cape, and it comes in different colors. And people make beech plum preserves that's actually absolutely delicious. They're fairly small fruits, but they have definite culinary uses, and so does the fruit of the wild plum, which is a small tree. And then there's the wild sumac, staghorn sumac. These are fuzzy fruits and fuzzy stems as well. And if you can make a lemonade substitute simply by soaking those fruits for about 10 minutes or so. And that's all you need. You don't even need to add sweetener. It tastes perfectly good, right? Just as it is. And I think tastes better than lemonade. Here's another species. Likewise, you could make a lemonade or a sumacade from these smooth sumac berries. And because they don't have hairs, they're useful. They've been used in Middle East cuisine as a lemon substitute. High bush blueberry and low bush blueberry really don't need an introduction for most people. You know a blueberry when you see it, and so do birds. Huckleberries are different from blueberries because they first, they have exactly 10 seeds in each fruit, while blueberries have many more than 10. And also at the tip of a huckleberry, you'll just see a neat circle, comparing that to a star-shaped tip of the blueberry. But huckleberries are every bit as edible as blueberries. And so when you find any of them, make good use of them. And there are two species of grapes out there growing in the wild. The ones that are quite small are the riverside grapes, and the larger ones, you can smell them before you see them often, are called fox grapes. And the fox grapes were bred to become Concord grapes. So fox grape is the ancestor of the Concord. Either grape is perfectly good for making grape juice or anything you make grapes, you use grapes for. They won't taste like your common table grapes, that's for sure. And in fact, the grape leaves can be used. People are quite familiar with stuffed grape leaves, for example. I'd like to mention a tree, the persimmon, that while it doesn't grow wild here, at least not yet, it might become part of our landscape as our planet warms. But it does grow farther south. In fact, it grows even as far north as northern Connecticut. Persimmon is a fruit that is just divine. In fact, the name Diosporus means fruit of the gods. And you could say that the persimmon is the most popular fruit in the world because so many different kinds of persimmons are eaten, especially in the Orient. So we have our own American persimmon, which I consider to be as delicious as any persimmon I've tasted. And you don't want to eat that persimmon when it's nice and smooth and firm, like you see it in the lower left corner. It's much too astringent. It'll pucker your mouth, and you'll swear you'll never want to eat a persimmon again. You need to wait until it's nice and soft, like the one in the upper left-hand corner. Notice how the leaves have all fallen. So October, November, December, you can still be eating persimmons here in New England, and they are hardy already here in New England. It's just a question of whether they'll become whether and when they'll become wild trees. So I want to recommend that you even consider planting persimmons on your property, because you'll be delighted a few years down the road to have these delicious fruits available. And the same can be said of pawpaw. Again, a tree that grows down south, but that is hardy and can grow just fine here in New England. That it's the pulp of the fruit, which has a kind of a custardy texture and taste. Wonderfully tropical fruit. Some people consider it to be the best tasting fruit in the world. It's the largest fruit on the American continent. It looks like a big green potato up there in the on the branch, and then those fruits fall. And once they fall, you know that they're ripe, even if the rind, if the skin is still green or mottled with brown. It doesn't look all that tasty because the fruit doesn't turn color on the outside, but on the inside, that's where the revelation is. Absolutely delicious tropical fruit that's growing right here on our continent, the pawpaw. You need two, by the way, two trees that are distinct genetically in order to have fruit. They need to cross-pollinate. And they will send out clones of themselves so that you can form a pawpaw grove with just a single tree. Now, there's a plant called chokeberry, but I'd rather call it aronia because I think chokeberry is a kind of an insulting name and doesn't make it sound at all appealing. The fruit, especially if you freeze it overnight, that makes it much more appealing. Or if you use it in cooking, baking juices and syrups, and a lot of wonderful medicinal properties for this plant. It's valuable. It's a wild tree. It grows here fairly, or tall shrub. Pollinators make good use of the flowers. Birds make good use of the fruits. And it's one that we should really be a lot more familiar with because it's a very high value plant, a superfruit that can be grown here in New England intentionally. In fact, Russians borrowed this fruit and improved it, and then we've borrowed it back, and there's a hybrid called, or rather a cultivar called the Viking, which is exceptional in terms of taste and harvest. Now there's the black walnut tree is a native tree in North America, and you have to take those nuts, get the husks off them, and dry them for a matter of months before they're finally ready to crack. And cracking is no easy matter. You really have to shatter that nut with a hammer or with a vise or a black walnut cracker. But it's worth the effort, in my opinion, because those nuts are absolutely delicious. I think they're better tasting than the English walnut that you buy in the store. In general, I don't suggest you plant black walnuts because they get to be huge at maturity, and they also inhibit the growth of many other plants near them. The same can be said of the butternut. It's a huge tree at maturity. It takes a lot of work to get the meat out of those nuts, and they're fairly small. And butternut is also susceptible to butternut canker. So a lot of butternut trees have died in the wild. But this is another edible wild plant offering free nuts. And the same is true of hickories. Again, a very tall tree, large tree. The nuts are small. They're hard to break open, but they are delicious when you take the effort to do so. There's almost a maple sweetened maple taste about the kernels. Here's an invasive plant, so this Heliagnus umbellata it was brought here for a plant that would colonize quickly, and it has done that because it can actually fix atmospheric nitrogen, but it's been too successful, and it's crowding out native plants. So help yourself to the fruits of this autumn olive. They are very high in lycopenes, much higher than tomatoes for that matter, and they are quite good tasting. But please do not plant them on purpose on your property, because we need to be controlling this plant as much as possible. Wherever you find it growing, why not help yourself to these abundant fruits? You can make a fruit leather from the fruit sauce. That's absolutely delicious. Virtually every part of the American lotus is edible, I understand. I've never tried it myself, but it's intriguing. Perhaps someday I will. Arrowhead is another aquatic plant that was used by Native Americans, but you had to be ready to go into that frigid water to harvest them. Groundnuts, Native Americans used this nut extensively and taught the settlers, the pilgrim colonists in and pilgrims who came to Plymouth, that first winter they survived largely on groundnuts. These tubers have more protein than potatoes and are better tasting as well. So this is another plant that can actually be intentionally cultivated and harvested. It is a perennial. And then there are plants that one can drink for tea. Catnip is a kind of a mint, very calming and soothing. Likewise, lemon balm. Both of these are good for insomnia. Peppermint and spearmint are other mints that are make delightful teas and are used in cooking as well. They're good for indigestion. Here's another one that's high vitamin mint. This is actually a creeping rather than a plant that grows in a more typical habit of upright habit of other mints. But and you'll find even in the middle of winter, you'll find leaves of ground ivy that are still green and that you can harvest. So while it may not be your favorite tasting plant, it's available. Coltsfoot is another plant that's edible at various stages, both the flowers and the leaves, and it's medicinal. It's helpful for coughs. Sassafras roots have the root beer taste. In fact, that was how root beer was originally made, and you can make sassafras tea by boiling those roots. You can also use the leaves. They have a kind of a gumbo flower. Use the leaves in cooking. White pine, incredible vitamin content in the needles. Surprisingly, you can make pine needle tea and make and avail yourself of those vitamins. And in fact, Native Americans made extensive use of this plant and many other plants that I've discussed today. And the sap has antimicrobial properties. Pitch was used to draw out boils and abscesses, and is also good for bladder and kidneys. And scientists have identified proanthocyanidins in pine needles, which are antioxidant, antidepressant, antibacterial, antiviral, anti-tumor, anti-inflammatory, immune system boosting, cardiovascular protecting, triglyceride reducing, and more. There is a caution: women who are pregnant or could become pregnant are advised not to drink pine needle tea in general, as it could cause abortion. Eastern hemlock is another evergreen that has foliage that's useful. Then hemlock needle tea is also rich in vitamin C, and the steam from the tea is used to treat rheumatism, colds, and coughs. Inner bark is a survival food, can be ground for flour. Also, a variety of ailments can be treated with Canadian hemlock or Eastern hemlock. There are some other plants: Juniperus virginiana, Betula lenta, black birch. You can make tea from the twigs or buds. Wintergreen, another famous tea, also called tea berry for that reason. Linden, very popular in Europe. The flowers of linden are used to make tea. They're very popular with bees as well. Honeybees just swarm over linden flowers. Redbud flowers are edible. You can put them in your cereal, for example. This is a plant that's much appreciated by pollinators when the flowers are blooming in the spring. Wisteria, I mentioned earlier, you can eat the flowers, but the pods are deathly poisonous. Flowers of black locust are also quite tasty. They're amazingly sweet. The flowers of rugosa rose are edible, but it's the rose hip that's the most valuable part of the rugosa rose. And you can find this plant growing on the Cape. Rose hips are very high in vitamin C. You could just eat them or dry them and make rose hip tea. So happy and safe foraging, everyone, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have at this time.
Thank you, John. That was really fascinating. I'm not really familiar with foraging out, so this is a new one for me, but I
Right.
did have a couple of questions
Okay.
in the chat. The first was curly dock. That
Yeah.
intrigued me.
Yeah.
It didn't look familiar to me. Where can I find that?
Curly dock is it's actually quite common. You know, when you learn a plant, you'll start to see it everywhere. So curly dock it's a weed that you won't find it in the woods. In fact, most of these plants you won't find in the woods. But when where there's sunshine, where there's disturbed soil, curly dock and where the lawnmower is not doing its thing, right?
Okay.
Just look around at disturbed areas, and it's quite distinctive, really. It sends a fairly tall, interesting colored brown. The seed heads, very tiny seeds.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And catnip, is it the same as the catnip that we give cats?
It is the same, absolutely the same. Yeah. And I really, it's delicious. And it's funny how it has the opposite effect on us. It really stimulates cats, of course, but it has a very calming effect for humans.
Yeah. Anybody else with questions? I see everybody muted.
Yeah, you mentioned, let's see, what was it? Oh, Purslane, which I have actually harvested out of my patio. I didn't realize its Latin name was Portulaca.
Yes, isn't that interesting? It is a portulaca, and if you look at the flower, if you're a gardener, you see portulaca flowers, you can see the family resemblance.
Right. So does that mean that the flower portulaca is edible as well?
I would not make any assumptions about related plants being edible. No, I would have to do that research. You really need to know, unless you see evidence, that every member of this genus is edible. Well, then you can go with that. But I cannot speak to that.
Okay.
But isn't it amazing how many of these plants people have been weeding out of their garden and throwing, right? And with absolutely no awareness that they could actually be bringing those plants into the kitchen.
Right. That's the only thing I know to forage. Yeah. It is really good added to a salad.
Yeah, it is. It's delicious.
So another question, which is that you'll probably elicit the same answer. You mentioned the daylily, which I've actually also tried. But you showed the Hemerocallis fulva, the gutter daylily.
Right,
so
and that one does escape cultivation very easily. Right. You'll find it growing wild.
Right. So what about cultivated hybrids?
I'm sure they're fine too.
Yeah. Okay.
But with that caveat that I mentioned, that they're not fine for 5% of the population. So the first time you try daylilies, just do it in moderation. And if you feel kind of like there's something, you feel a little bit like if some kind of slight disagreeable reaction, well, then that's not for you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I also want to mention violets because they take over my garden and I pull them up and I throw them out. But now that I know, I knew about the flowers, but I never knew about the leaves.
That's a typical reaction. Flowers, in my opinion, are really pretty worthless. They're pretty, and some people, they I guess they candy them. Well, then it's the sugar that you're eating, and not the flower is really just for appearance. But in terms of health, oh my gosh, the violet leaves are just a powerhouse. More vitamin. I mentioned more vitamin C than oranges. So it's a great plant.
So that's amazing. So now I know, instead of throwing them in the woods, I'll save the leaves.
And I think you'll appreciate the taste too. When you cook them, there's a slight, how okra is quite mucilaginous, right? Well, violet leaves are nowhere near that mucilaginous, but they do have some of that quality, and there's a very faint pepperiness to them. So they're really quite pleasing.
Yeah, good to know. Anybody else? Okay, well, I guess we're done, John. Thank you. This was really interesting
My pleasure.
and I really appreciate it.
Yes,
And,
thank you very much.
right. And there are ways to, one thing I could mention is that there's a Facebook page, if you're on Facebook, a Facebook group called Native Plants of New England. And if you have any question about identification of any plant, you can just take pictures and put it up, post it, and you'll immediately get a number of answers. And you can pretty much rely, especially when they all say the same thing and they say it with confidence. Sometimes individuals might be wrong, but you can get a lot of information that way. Native Plants of New England.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay.
I do have one question.
Yeah.
It's me. Is lamb's ear the same as the lamb's plant that you
No.
were talking?
Lambsquarters and lamb's ears are totally different plants. That's why it can help to learn Latin names as well.
Okay.
Chenopodium album is lambsquarters. That's the one you want.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Well,
Anybody-
happy foraging, everyone.
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you very much. Enjoy the
Okay.
day, everyone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was interesting. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thanks, Mary.